November 1876. Wind carved through the Montana Territory high plains at 43 miles per hour, and Margaret Lindstrom watched three men argue about whether digging a hole beneath her cabin would kill her faster than the winter would. She'd been a widow for 8 months. Her husband Eric had taken fever that spring, and by June she was alone on 160 acres with a 10-year-old son, a cabin that leaked, and the kind of problem that didn't announce itself until you were already dying from it. The firewood she'd spent July and August splitting, stacking, and covering with canvas tarps had a way of soaking through every time the autumn rains hit. Come December, she'd be burning wet wood that gave off more smoke than heat, if it burned at all. Last winter the Hendersons lost their youngest that way. Smoke filled the cabin for 3 days straight while they burned damp cottonwood. The boys' lungs just gave out. Margaret had $47 left from selling Eric's plow team to the land speculator in Helena. She'd spent 3 of those dollars on an idea she'd read about in a settler's almanac that came through on the supply wagon. A storage pit dug directly beneath a cabin floor, accessible through a trapdoor, using the earth itself as insulation against moisture. The almanac claimed Norwegian farmers had been doing it for 200 years. The 3 men standing in her yard claimed she'd be doing it straight into her own grave. Thomas Garrett spoke first. He'd survived 4 Montana winters, built 3 cabins from scratch, and lost one to a roof collapse that nearly killed his wife. "Ma'am, you start undermining your foundation posts. You'll have the whole structure coming down on your head. I've seen it happen twice. Once in '72, once in '74, both times in spring when the ground thawed and shifted." He pointed at her southeast corner post. "That one's already sitting in soil that's half clay. You dig beneath it, you're asking for trouble." But standing next to him was Johann Weber, a German immigrant who'd worked railroad-grade construction before filing his homestead claim. He had the look of a man who'd moved more earth than most people would see in a lifetime. "The structure stays sound if you shore it proper," he said. "I've seen mines go 200 feet without collapse. This is 8 feet deep at most, yeah. With timber bracing, with careful work, it's possible." The third man was Henry Blackwood, a former Army engineer who'd mustered out at Fort Benton and decided the territory was preferable to going back east. He didn't say much, just walked the perimeter of the cabin, dropped to his knees at each corner post, measured distances with a length of rope he kept in his pocket. When he finally stood up, he brushed the dirt off his hands and looked at Margaret with the kind of expression that said he was about to tell her something she wouldn't want to hear. "Your cabin's 12 by 16 feet. Foundation posts are 30 inches deep. If we dig 7 feet down and 8 feet across, centered beneath the floor, we clear your posts by 18 inches minimum on all sides. That's enough buffer if we use proper shoring." He paused. "But ma'am, November's late to start this kind of work. Ground's already starting to freeze at night. You've got maybe 2 weeks before it's too hard to dig." Margaret looked at the 3 of them, then at the canvas-covered woodpile that was already showing dark patches where water had seeped through. "How much?" she asked. Henry calculated in his head. "Timber for shoring, rope, pulley system to haul dirt, trapdoor hinges, labor for 3 men over 4 days. I'd say $65, maybe $70. She had $47. She said so out loud. Johann Weber tilted his head, thinking, "What if we use deadfall timber instead of purchased lumber? There's a stand of beetle-killed pine about 2 miles north. Fallen trees, good and dry, straight enough for bracing. And if we work for meals instead of cash wages, just split the actual material costs." Thomas Garrett shook his head. "You're still talking about excavating under an occupied structure. One mistake and the boy's motherless as well as fatherless." But Margaret's son Peter had appeared in the cabin doorway, 10 years old with his father's serious gray eyes. He'd been listening. "The almanac said the Vikings did it," he offered quietly. "The Norse settlers. They dug storage pits under their longhouses. Some of them were 12 feet deep." Henry Blackwood almost smiled. "Your boy reads, does he?" "He reads everything we've got," Margaret said, "which isn't much, but he remembers all of it." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of coming snow. Thomas Garrett looked at the sky, then back at the cabin. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it right. No shortcuts. We dig from the outside first, create an access tunnel, then excavate beneath the floor. That way if something goes wrong, the cabin doesn't come down. It'll take 6 days instead of 4, but it's safer. Margaret did the math. 6 days of meals for 3 men. She had enough flour, salt pork, and dried beans to manage that, barely. What about the $47? Hinges, rope, and pulley, Henry said. Maybe a few feet of chain for the trapdoor. We can make it work. And if you're watching this because you value the kind of wisdom that kept people alive when there was no hardware store 50 miles away, no backup plan, and no room for error, go ahead and hit that like button. The techniques Margaret was about to bet her life on came from centuries of trial and error, and they're worth remembering. They started digging on November 8, 1876. The ground temperature at 6 inches deep was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. At 18 inches, it was 41 degrees. The Earth itself was a thermal battery, storing summer's heat and releasing it slowly through the winter months. That's what the almanac had said, and that's what Henry Blackwood confirmed with a simple test. He buried a thermometer wrapped in oilcloth at 3 feet deep, left it overnight, and pulled it up, reading 43 degrees, even though the air temperature had dropped to 26. The plan was methodical. Thomas insisted on it, and the others agreed. They marked out a rectangle 12 feet long by 6 feet wide, positioned 10 feet from the cabin's west wall. This would be the access trench. They'd dig down 7 feet, then tunnel horizontally toward the cabin, coming up beneath the floor in the southwest corner where Margaret stored her trunk and winter clothes. The tunnel would be 3 feet wide, just enough for a man to work in, and they'd shore every 18 inches with deadfall pine logs notched to lock together. Johann brought his railroad experience to bear on the first day. He showed them how to cut the sod in neat squares, stack them grass side down for later replacement. On the grade, we moved 10,000 cubic yards in a month, he said, his accent still thick after 6 years in America. This is maybe 40 cubic yards total. The challenge isn't the volume, it's the precision. He demonstrated the proper angle for a spade cut, how to leverage your body weight instead of your back, how to read the soil composition as you went deeper. At 2 feet, they hit a layer of clay mixed with river stone. At 4 feet, the clay gave way to sandy loam that was easier to move but wanted to collapse inward. Peter watched from a distance his mother deemed safe, asking questions that the men answered between shovel loads. "Why do the walls want to fall in?" he asked. "Soil's got weight," Henry explained, breathing hard. "Every cubic foot of this dirt weighs maybe 90 pounds. You take away what's holding it up, it wants to fill that space back in. That's why we shore as we go." He positioned a pine log vertically against the trench wall, then another opposite it, then wedged a crossbeam between them at the top. The wood holds back the weight. Long as the wood holds, the trench stays open. By the end of day 1, they were 5 feet deep. Margaret fed them salt pork stew with onions she'd grown in her kitchen garden, biscuits made from the last of her good flour, coffee sweetened with molasses. The men ate like they'd earned it, which they had. Thomas Garrett's hands were blistered despite his work gloves. Johann Weber had pulled a muscle in his shoulder but hadn't mentioned it until Margaret saw him wincing. Henry Blackwood sat with his back against the cabin wall, calculating tomorrow's work in his engineer's notebook by lamplight. "We're at good depth now," he said. "Tomorrow we start the horizontal tunnel. That's where it gets delicate." Thomas looked skeptical. "Delicate's one word for it. Suicidal's another." "You want to quit?" Margaret asked. Her voice was level, but Peter saw her hands tighten around her coffee cup. "No, ma'am," Thomas said after a moment. "I want to make sure we all understand the risk. When we start tunneling toward your cabin, we'll be working underneath several thousand pounds of structure. If we miscalculate the position of those foundation posts, if we hit one while we're digging, if the soil shifts, then we'll be careful," Johann interrupted. "We measure twice, we dig once, we shore constantly. This is not complicated, Thomas. It's just dangerous. There's a difference." Henry tapped his notebook. "I've mapped the post positions. We're coming in 18 inches south of the nearest one. I'll be in the tunnel myself, measuring every foot we advance. We'll know where we are." The temperature dropped to 19 degrees that night. Margaret lay awake in her bed, listening to Peter's breathing from his corner of the room, thinking about the hole in her yard that would either save them or collapse her cabin into kindling. The almanac was still on her table, open to the page about Norwegian storage pits. The text was matter of fact, written by someone who assumed the reader knew what they were doing. It didn't account for Montana clay, It didn't account for a widow with $47 and a 10-year-old son and winter coming on like an avalanche. Day 2 brought the tunnel. Henry went in first with a coal oil lamp, a shovel, and his measuring rope. The space was tight enough that he had to work on his knees, scooping dirt into a wooden bucket that Johann hauled up with the pulley system they'd rigged. Every 18 inches of forward progress, they stopped to install shoring. Thomas had notched the deadfall pine logs with an axe, creating interlocking joints that would hold without nails. It was painstaking work. By noon, they'd advanced 3 feet. By evening, they'd managed 7. Margaret brought food to them at the trench edge. She could hear Henry's voice echoing up from the tunnel, calling out measurements to Johann. 11 feet from the entry point, bearing northeast at 7 degrees, depth holding at 6'9". The precision was reassuring, but so was the fear in Thomas Garrett's eyes as he watched the tunnel swallow another bucket of dirt. "You've been quiet," Margaret said to him. Thomas looked at her, then at the cabin. "I'm thinking about the Hendersons," he said. "About their boy. About how they didn't have a choice. They burned wet wood because it was that or freeze. But you're choosing to risk your whole structure on an idea from a book. What if the book's wrong? What if Norway dirt doesn't work the same as Montana dirt?" "Then I'll learn something," Margaret said. "And if I'm still alive when I learn it, I'll do better next time." That got a small smile out of him. "You're steady, I'll give you that." "I'm scared," she corrected. "But scared doesn't matter if the work still needs doing. Join others who are preserving this kind of frontier wisdom, the knowledge that kept families alive when everything depended on getting it right the first time. Subscribe to keep these traditional techniques from being forgotten, because the steady courage of people like Margaret deserves to be remembered. Day 3 was when they broke through beneath the cabin floor. Henry's shovel hit the underside of the floorboards at 2 in the afternoon, making a hollow thunk that Margaret felt through her feet as she stood in the kitchen. She moved Peter outside immediately, then waited while the men below assessed the structure. The tunnel had come up exactly where Henry had calculated, southwest corner, 18 inches from the nearest foundation post, in the space beneath her storage trunk. The challenge now was cutting through the floor without destabilizing the cabin. Henry marked out a rectangle 3 feet by 4 feet, the size of the trapdoor they'd build. Thomas, working from below, drilled pilot holes up through the floorboards at each corner using a brace and bit. Then they switched positions. Thomas went up into the cabin, Henry stayed below, and together they cut the opening with a crosscut saw, one man pulling down, one man pulling up. The sawdust fell like snow into the tunnel below. When the trapdoor section finally came free, afternoon light spilled down into the excavated space for the first time. Peter, allowed back inside now, peered down into the hole. "It's bigger than I thought," he said. It was. The chamber beneath the cabin was 8 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 7 feet deep at the center, tapering to 6 feet at the edges where it cleared the foundation posts. The walls were shored with deadfall pine on all 4 sides, the ceiling supported by 4 substantial crossbeams that Thomas had insisted on despite Johann's protests that 2 would be sufficient. The floor was hard-packed earth that Henry had leveled with a rake. "Temperature down there?" Margaret asked. Henry checked his thermometer. 46 degrees. Air temperature up here is 28. That's an 18-degree difference, and we haven't sealed it yet or filled it with firewood. The physics were working. The Earth's thermal mass was doing exactly what the almanac had promised, moderating temperature, keeping the space above freezing even as winter tightened its grip on the surface. But there was more to it than temperature. The underground chamber was also protected from precipitation, from wind, from the freeze-thaw cycles that turned surface-stored wood into rot. Johann explained it while they built the trapdoor frame. "In the old country, my grandfather kept potatoes in a pit like this. 10 months they lasted, some years. The earth keeps steady, not too warm, not too cold, not too wet, not too dry. It's like the cellar, yeah? But better because it's deeper, because it's insulated on all sides." The trapdoor itself was a piece of engineering that Henry took particular pride in. They built it from 1-inch pine boards, reinforced with cross-bracing, hung on 3 iron hinges that had cost Margaret 12 of her $47. The hinges were the expensive part, but they were also essential. The door needed to support the weight of Margaret's trunk plus however much force a person might put on it walking across that section of floor. Henry installed a hasp and padlock on the inside, accessible only through a small secondary hatch, so Peter couldn't accidentally open it and fall through. By the end of day 4, the underground chamber was complete. The access tunnel from outside had been refilled, the sod squares replaced, the excess dirt scattered across Margaret's property. From the surface, there was no sign of the work except for a slight depression where the soil would settle over the next few months. Inside the cabin, the only evidence was the trapdoor, which sat flush with the floor and could be covered with a rug once Margaret's trunk was repositioned. The total cost, $46.75. 25 cents under budget. Thomas Garrett stood in the cabin, looking down through the open trapdoor into the chamber below. He'd been the most skeptical, the most vocal about the risks, the most certain it couldn't be done. Now he just shook his head slowly. "I'll be damned," he said. "It actually worked." "It worked because you insisted on doing it right," Margaret told him. "Those extra shoring beams, the outside tunnel instead of digging from inside, measuring everything twice, that was you." "And it worked because Johann knew how to read the soil," Thomas said. "And because Henry knew the engineering. And because you had the nerve to try it in the first place." He extended his hand to her. "Your husband would be proud." Margaret shook his hand, then the others. She fed them one final meal, the best she could manage with what she had left, and sent them home before dark. Then she and Peter started the work of moving firewood, but moving firewood turned out to be the moment when everything Margaret had built almost came apart. They started with the driest wood, the pieces she'd split in July and stored under the tightest canvas cover. Peter carried armloads to the cabin door. Margaret lowered them through the trapdoor into the chamber below. After an hour, they'd moved maybe a tenth of what needed to go down there. Peter's arms were shaking with fatigue. Margaret's back was screaming from the bending and lifting, and then she realized the fundamental problem they'd overlooked in all the careful planning. The chamber was perfect for storage. The temperature was stable, the moisture was minimal, the wood would stay dry all winter, but it was 7 feet deep. She couldn't just toss wood down there. It would shatter, and she couldn't climb down with every armload. That would take weeks. They needed a system, and they needed it immediately because the first serious snow was forecast for tomorrow night. Peter solved it. He was sitting on the cabin floor, exhausted and frustrated, when he looked at the pulley system Johann had left behind. "What if we use that?" he asked. "Lower the wood in batches instead of one piece at a time?" Margaret looked at the pulley, then at the pile of rope. "We'd need a platform," she said slowly. "Something to hold the wood while we lower it." "We've got the wood from the trapdoor cutout," Peter pointed out. "The piece that was the floor." They built a platform from the cutout section, attached the rope, ran it through the pulley that they mounted to one of the cabin's ceiling beams. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Margaret could load 20 pieces of firewood on the platform, lower it into the chamber, climb down the ladder they'd built from deadfall pine, unload the platform, climb back up, and repeat. It was still hard work, but it was possible. They worked until midnight. Then they slept 4 hours and started again at dawn. By the time the snow started falling at 3 o'clock on November 13th, they had 2 full cords of firewood in the underground chamber, enough to get them through to January if they were careful. The rest of the wood pile, still under canvas, would stay outside for now. They'd move it down in stages as winter progressed, and they used up what was below. The snow fell for 36 hours straight. 17 inches accumulated in the first day, another 9 overnight, then a final 6 inches, before the storm blew itself out over the mountains. The temperature dropped to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill made it feel like -38. These were the conditions that killed people, that found every weakness in a cabin's construction, every gap in a family's preparation. Margaret opened the trapdoor and climbed down to get wood for the morning fire. The chamber was 49 degrees. The wood was bone dry. When she brought it up and fed it to the stove, it caught immediately, burned hot and clean, gave off heat instead of smoke. Peter woke up to warmth instead of cold. They had coffee instead of shivering through breakfast. The difference wasn't subtle. By December, word had spread. Thomas Garrett told his neighbors about the underground chamber. Johann Weber mentioned it to the other German families clustered near the Helena Road. Henry Blackwood wrote about it in a letter to his former commanding officer at Fort Benton, and people started coming to see it. Some were believers immediately. Carl Fischer, another German immigrant, had been struggling with the same wet firewood problem. He paid Margaret $2 for permission to examine the chamber and take measurements, then dug his own version using the exact same techniques. His cost $52 because he had to purchase lumber for shoring instead of using deadfall pine. Others remained skeptical until they couldn't anymore. Rebecca Walsh had lost her husband the previous winter to smoke inhalation from burning damp wood. She stood in Margaret's cabin in mid-December, felt the warmth from the stove, watched how cleanly the wood burned, and started crying. "James died because we didn't know about this," she said. "He died because we were trying to save money by cutting green wood and hoping it would dry enough." Margaret didn't have easy words for that. Sometimes knowledge came too late to save the people you loved. But she gave Rebecca the measurements, the techniques, the lessons they'd learned. Rebecca hired Johann and Henry to dig a chamber beneath her cabin in January, working in frozen ground that took twice as long to excavate. It cost her $83. She paid it without hesitation. By spring, 7 families within a 20-mile radius had built underground storage chambers. Each one was slightly different, adapted to the specific soil conditions, the cabin layout, the available materials. But they all shared the same core principles: depth for thermal stability, proper shoring for safety, access through the cabin floor for convenience in winter storms. The innovation saved lives that winter. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines, but quietly and certainly. The Hendersons' surviving children didn't get sick from smoke. Rebecca Walsh didn't lose her second husband. Carl Fischer's pregnant wife delivered a healthy baby in February because they'd been able to maintain consistent cabin heat throughout the coldest months. And Margaret Lindstrom made it through her first winter as a widow with her son healthy, her cabin standing, and $47 worth of knowledge that proved more valuable than any amount of money. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because what those Montana settlers figured out in 1876 wasn't actually new. They'd independently rediscovered a principle that humans had been using for thousands of years. In Norway, archaeological evidence shows underground storage pits beneath houses dating back to 800 AD. The Vikings called them underjordiske kjellere, underground cellars, and they used them for food, for ale, for anything that needed to stay cool in summer and unfrozen in winter. The construction techniques were remarkably similar to what Johann Weber and Henry Blackwood used: timber shoring, careful excavation, access through the floor. In China, the Yaodong cave dwellings of the Loess Plateau had been using Earth's thermal mass for shelter and storage since the Bronze Age. These weren't just pits. They were entire homes carved into hillsides, maintaining temperatures between 50 and 65 degrees year-round, regardless of surface conditions. Some Yaodong complexes housed thousands of people, their underground chambers interconnected in ways that would have made Henry Blackwood's engineering notebook look simplistic. Native peoples across North America had their own versions. The Hidatsa stored corn in underground cache pits lined with grass and bark. The Pawnee built earth lodges with below-grade storage areas. The principles were universal because the physics were universal. Earth is a thermal battery. Moisture resistance improves with depth. Temperature stability increases with proper insulation. What made Margaret's story significant wasn't the originality of the idea. It was the transmission of knowledge across cultural boundaries, the willingness to trust techniques that seemed risky because the alternative was worse, and the proof that old wisdom could solve new problems if you had the courage to try. Modern homesteaders have rediscovered these techniques again, this time with fancy names like earth-coupled thermal mass storage and passive geothermal regulation. The physics haven't changed. A study by the Colorado State University Extension in 2019 measured underground storage temperatures at various depths in different soil types. At 7 feet deep in clay loam soil, the temperature varied only between 42 and 56 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface temperatures ranging from -20 to 98 degrees. That's a 70-degree swing on the surface compressed to a 14-degree swing underground. Exactly what Henry Blackwood's thermometer showed in November 1876. The difference is that modern builders have concrete, have engineered lumber, have moisture barriers and ventilation systems. Margaret had deadfall pine, rope, and determination. Her chamber worked because the principles were sound, not because the materials were sophisticated. That's what makes frontier innovation remarkable. It was forced simplicity that revealed fundamental truths. Margaret Lindstrom lived in that cabin until 1891, when Peter was 25 and had filed his own homestead claim on adjacent land. She never remarried. She became known in the area as someone who understood how to work with the land instead of fighting it, how to borrow from other cultures' accumulated wisdom, how to calculate risk without being paralyzed by it. When younger settlers came through asking for advice, she'd show them the underground chamber, explain the mathematics of thermal mass, and tell them about the Norwegian almanac that had saved her life. The chamber itself lasted until 1909, when Peter dismantled the cabin to build a larger house for his own growing family. He salvaged the pine shoring beams, which were still sound after 33 years underground. Some of those beams ended up in his barn, where they served for another 40 years before finally rotting through. The physics that kept wood dry worked both ways. The chamber preserved the beams, and the beams preserved the chamber. If you're still watching, you understand that this isn't just a history lesson. This is about the principle that knowledge compounds across generations when we're willing to learn from the past, adapt to present circumstances, and share what works with the people around us. Subscribe to help document these forgotten techniques, because every traditional skill that disappears is a solution we might desperately need someday when modern systems fail. The real legacy of that $46 excavation beneath a Montana widow's cabin wasn't the specific chamber. It was the demonstration that survival often depends less on what you can afford and more on what you're willing to learn, who you're willing to trust, and how carefully you're willing to work. Thomas Garrett brought skepticism that forced precision. Johann Weber brought experience that enabled execution. Henry Blackwood brought knowledge that prevented disaster. Margaret brought necessity that made it all matter. And Peter, 10 years old and watching every detail, brought the future. He grew up understanding that the earth beneath your feet is a resource if you know how to use it, that cross-cultural knowledge is a survival advantage, that the difference between life and death is often just the difference between wet wood and dry wood. He taught those principles to his own children, who passed them to theirs, creating a lineage of practical wisdom that stretched from Norwegian longhouses through Montana homesteads into the 20th century and beyond. In a world that increasingly values convenience over competence, that treats traditional knowledge as quaint rather than essential, that assumes modern technology has made old techniques obsolete. Stories like Margaret's remind us that fundamental physics don't change just because we've invented better tools. The Earth is still a thermal battery. Depth still provides stability. Proper shoring still prevents collapse. And sometimes the best solution to a problem is the one that people figured out 1,000 years ago in a completely different place. The Montana winter of 1876-77 killed 37 people in the territory, most from cold, some from starvation, a few from smoke inhalation in poorly ventilated cabins. Margaret Lindstrom and her son weren't among them because they'd taken a $47 gamble on knowledge that crossed an ocean, adapted techniques that predated written records, and trusted skeptics who insisted on precision even when speed seemed more important. That's the kind of wisdom worth preserving. That's the kind of story that deserves to be told. And that's why these frontier accounts matter more than just historical curiosity. They're evidence that human ingenuity, when faced with genuine necessity, finds solutions that work across cultures, across centuries, across whatever circumstances we think are unique to our own moment in time. The underground chamber beneath Margaret Lindstrom's cabin was never fancy. It was never perfect. It was just $46 worth of dirt, timber, and knowledge that kept a family alive through winter. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.